All right, plenty around, including The Voice, of course. Joining me now, while Dennis Shanahan is on leave, I'm delighted to say, a special treat, Paul Kelly, Editor-at-Large at the Australian newspaper. Paul, welcome to the program. I want to kick off, if we can, with The Voice. A big decision by the Liberal Party room to formally oppose the Prime Minister's voice last week, of course, on Wednesday. And Peter Dutton's announcement, too, that he will campaign against it. Now, some were surprised that this was an overwhelming majority decision of the party room. This wasn't the leader's fiat. This was a party room call. We were told only a small number of MPs, around 5, have said in the party room they would still campaign for the voice. I know it's taken a number of months to land where they have, but give us your assessment on the politics here for the Liberals, but also the broader coalition.
Well, Peter, it's very good to be with you. I don't think anyone should be surprised at the decision Peter Dutton took to oppose the voice that's on offer, that particular model, and to campaign against it. And that was clearly the majority view in his own party room and the majority view of his front bench. That shouldn't be any surprise given the nature of the model. Of course, there are divisions in the party. And I think particularly at state level, we'll see quite significant divisions with a number of Liberals supporting the referendum being put by Anthony Albanese. The broader point to make here is that there's been never a sense of ownership on the part of the coalition and the Liberal Party of this proposal. It was opposed by John Howard, opposed by Tony Abbott, opposed by Malcolm Turnbull when he was Prime Minister, opposed by Scott Morrison, and now opposed by both David Littleproud and Peter Dutton, the coalition leaders. And I think this, in a sense, is part of the tragedy, that there's never been a concerted dialogue and a negotiation with the Conservative side to see if it was possible to strike some sort of arrangement. So given the model that was on offer, no surprise at all what Peter Dutton did.
Well, I want to pick you up on that too, because you go back to the first instance that recognition was talked about, constitutional recognition. That was John Howard, supported very much by Tony Abbott when he was party leader, supported by Tony Abbott, of course, when he was PM. And we know that going into that period in 2013, there was an Indigenous Recognition Act passed the Parliament, supported by, obviously put forward by Labor, but supported wholeheartedly by the coalition. It's because I assume, Paul, that we've moved so far away from constitutional recognition to now what many argue, Janet Albrechtsen today, we'll get to that in a moment, has the potential, is likely to be this all-powerful fourth arm of the government, I think even bigger than the third chamber of the Parliament Malcolm Turnbull phrased it as. That's been the departure, and that's where they've lost the Conservative side of politics.
Well, look, I've called this a tragedy, and I do think it's a tragedy because I think more than 90% of the Australian people would support Indigenous recognition in the Constitution and also some sort of consultative body when it comes to the Indigenous peoples. But the difficulty is this is now fused with the proposed voice, and the voice at the end of the day has got to be assessed in terms of the constitutional power being created and the terms and conditions under which that constitutional power will be used. And the point to make is, briefly, a new chapter of the Australian Constitution is being created. This is extraordinary. This is a very clear indication that this is a substantive measure which will change governance, which will change the way the Parliament and the executive government works in this country. And if we look then at the words in terms of the constitutional amendment, it's clear that what we're talking about here is a group rights political body which will have virtually unlimited constitutional remit in terms of making representations to the Parliament and to the executive government. Now, that is a very, very substantial change to the Constitution and to the way the Parliament and the executive government operates. And for people to say that this is simply being courteous or polite or modest, and above all for people to say that we don't really need to look at the words and assess the words, people who argue that are engaging in a deception A constitutional amendment depends on the words. We're creating a new and important institution, and it's got to be assessed in terms of the constitutional power that it has.
That's the point that Janet Albrechtsen makes today. I mean, she goes into some detail, drafts a proposed letter, I think we can call it that if the Voice was to get up, that the people in and around the Voice could send to government next day with their ambit claims based on what they regard as their constitutional footing. She's written this with the constitutional law experts, the letters published there in the paper today. She makes a point that under Labor's plan, with this language as it stands, we'll have co-government and we'll have policy chaos. Now, Paul Kelly, is she right?
Well, look, Peter, the point to make here is that all sorts of things might happen and all sorts of things might not happen. We can't predict. But what we can do is we can look at the words of the constitutional amendment. This is what we're required to do. And those words are very substantial. It means that the Voice can be making representations across the ambit of executive government to the Cabinet, to all ministers, to public servants, to departmental heads, to authorities, from Centrelink to the Great Barrier Reef Authority, to resource development authorities, to climate change authorities. That is the power that's been created. And we should bear in mind that when people tell us that we shouldn't really assess the power, or when the Prime Minister says that questions about whether the Voice would have given recommendations to the Parliament in terms of the safeguard mechanism, that this is a distraction, well, I think that is a very deceptive comment on the part of the Prime Minister. We need to look at the power that's been created, and frankly, if the Voice was in operation, then one assumes the Voice would have given recommendations in relation to the safeguard mechanism, just as one assumes the Voice would give recommendations on a whole series of issues, whether they primarily concern Indigenous people or whether they simply concern Indigenous people as part of the broader Australian population. That's the power being created, that's the institution being created, and we should look at that, consider that, and people should make a judgment about how that would work in terms of the operation of the Australian government and Parliament. I mean, this is about a fundamental change in power. And the Indigenous leaders have been frank enough to say that. That's what they're saying. The Prime Minister is not saying that, and he needs to be, I think, called to account far more than what we've seen so far, and asked to explain how the Voice will actually work.
Just Paul, just quickly, I mean, how can we have a reasonable debate when we haven't got the information? The Prime Minister won't talk to us about the detail. You're right, some Indigenous leaders are bellying their cat with a little bit that they've put out there. You've got people like Noel Pearson, whom I regard highly, or used to regard highly, I might say, really going after Julie and Lisa, and absolutely without a doubt making comments that reference his Jewish faith. He made those on SBS on Thursday night. I played them in my comments a little earlier. How can we have a reasonable debate if that's the tone we're getting from the Yes campaign?
Well, it's up to both sides of the campaign to try and ensure we have a reasonable debate. But, I mean, it won't be easy. This is a very important referendum. There are very important competing positions held on both sides. Noel Pearson is someone that I have admired and respected for many decades. I think some of the comments that he's made have been unwise and inappropriate, but I recognise the role he's played as a principal architect, perhaps the principal architect of the Voice. But I think it's really important that that both sides try to ensure we have a civil debate. Finally, I might say about the coalition position, while I recognised that Peter Dutton was going to oppose the model of the Voice on offer, I do have queries about the actual position that the coalition has adopted and the tactical wisdom of that, saying that they support a legislated voice at local and regional level, but not at the national level, and then putting a big emphasis on the Solicitor General's opinion. I think that there are questions to be raised in terms of the wisdom of the actual opposition position there.
Yeah, I agree with you. I wrote yesterday in my column, I think that will die a quick death this week, and it'll be a position of great clarity because you can't be half pregnant on The Voice. Paul Kelly, thank you.